Echoing. That's really funny. So good morning, party people, and welcome to the morning Q&A stream. For those of you who are new around here, I'm Brent Ozar, Microsoft Certified Master of SQL Server, and I do open office hours podcasts or streams where I take any kinds of questions about Microsoft SQL Server, just about Microsoft SQL Server though. To ask a question, you can post it over there at polgab.com/room/Brento, and you can also vote on the questions that other people are asking so that I take the most popular ones. Should be here for about 2 hours altogether. We'll do a bio break about an hour in, just so that I can go refuel my espresso. And then I'll stop in about 2 hours at 8 a.m. Pacific time. Because my restaurant downstairs, I say mine, but the coffee shop downstairs in my building is open today. And this will be the last day for a few weeks. California, a lot of counties in California are going under lockdown again. Kind of like how the governor did it. Gavin Newsom did a lockdown where if our ICUs, I don't know what I see, intensive care units, I immediately think of internal combustion engines. But if the intensive care units have less than 15% capacity, then they lock down that region of California. So Southern California was lower than 15% availability for the last several days. I think it's like a rolling 3-day thing. If it's lower than that for 3 days straight, then they go under lockdown. So starting tonight at midnight, G-Surgeon from the Netherlands, SQL Dev DBA says, I wish Florida would follow suit. It's funny. In California, I kind of see why. It's very left-leaning, it's very liberal, which is one of the things that I like about it. They take the environment seriously, they take people seriously, all that kind of thing. But even here, there's a lot of pushback when they go to lock it down. There have been gyms and restaurants saying that, screw it, we're going to still stay open regardless. So it's been kind of interesting to see. But so anyway, it's tomorrow. Today's the last day that our restaurants are open. We've been going out to a bunch of restaurants and tipping the bejesus out of our. I didn't know you were in Sweden. Oh, Adam, I never knew that that's what SWE stood for. Oh, that makes sense. I can't close my Disney. So I've been tipping the bejesus out of our restaurant workers because I still remember I spent years working in hospitality and I know firsthand how tough it is financially when these places close, the hotels and restaurants close. There's no plan B for a lot of these people. They don't have any other income stream, and a lot of it is cash based on tips. So if you can afford to tip your local restaurant and hotel type staff, now's the time definitely to show your appreciation for those kind folks who really work their tail end off. Yeah, hospitality, it's been really rough, and there's been a lot of here in California that they're trying to close down non-essential travel. The way that they're doing that is that they're not allowing hotels to take in tourist guests. You have to be like an essential worker in order to check in at a hotel now. So that makes it even tougher for hotels, like housekeepers who work off of tips. It's really, really tough. So good morning, folks. Well, let's go see what's in the question queue over here. So we have, first up we'll take is Stefan says, performance-wise, what is better, union or thank you for everything? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a demo to show you what he's talking about, what Stefan's talking about, and how to measure. So let's go pop into Stack Overflow. So I'm going to pop into this. This is going to be a little fuzzy too because I'm working in the dark today because I want to. So I'm going to pop into Stack Overflow and I'm going to start by dropping indexes. And then I'm going to run a query. I'm going to say select star from DBO users where display name equals Brent Ozar. Hey, Pete, how's it going? Or location equals San Diego, California. So if I run this query, and I shouldn't have gotten the actual execution plan for drop indexes, I don't need that just to get the indexes out of the way. So if I run this and I have no indexes whatsoever, SQL servers only execute, and wow, there are a lot more people in San Diego than I thought. SQL servers only possible execution plan is a table scan. However, if I put in indexes, I can help him make decisions. Joe says, what's the big N? Stands for Napoleon. I tried to come up with something on that stands for Unicode. It's whatever means that whatever's inside there is Unicode, and I have to do that. I don't have to do it, but I do it because these are nvarchar columns that we're dealing with. Otherwise, we get an implicit conversion warning, and people are like, why do we have an implicit conversion warning? So I'm going to say create index display name on DBO users display name. And then I'm going to create an identical index over on location, create index location on DBO users location. So what this does is it gives SQL Server two choices as to how it could go through and execute this query now. It could either do a table scan, or it could look up the users named Brent and the users in San Diego in two different index operations. And SQL Server is pretty smart. So if I read the query from right to left, top to bottom, the first thing that SQL Server did was it used the index on display name to find all the people named Brent. And it used the index on location to find all the people who live in San Diego. Then it joined those two result sets together, and it only did key lookups for the rows that match. In this case, OR is completely fine. SQL Server used both of the indexes to accomplish its goals. However, sometimes in some specific scenarios, PS, make sure to read the thing up at the top of the screen there. So in some specific scenarios, to get SQL Server to use the index, you have to break it out into two separate queries. You have to say, for example, select star from users named Brent Ozar, union, select star from users where location equals San Diego. So the kinds of places where you have to use this union trick are when SQL Server thinks that the combination of both of these would be higher than the number of rows in the tipping point. Like SQL Server says, you know what, screw it, there are going to be too many rows that are going to match, so I'm better off just breaking, doing the whole entire table scan. Now, I haven't rehearsed this demo, so I'm going to try a couple of things to see if I can find a query that will hit the tipping point and it will break with OR, but it'll work with union. I'm going to give myself like 60 seconds. It may not work. Let's see. So I'm going to try one of the most common display names in Stack Overflow database, and I'm going to try one of the more common locations. We'll say London. Let's try to see what that looks like and see if SQL Server, nope, he still used the index, even though we're at about 5,000 there. Let's try United States and see what happens. And still willing to use the index, still up at about like 25,000 now. Let's try India and see if I can get it to work. And here SQL Server does a clustered index scan. All right, so the combination of Alex and India seems to do it. Let's see if I break it out into two separate queries, if SQL Server will do the index operation on both. Let's take a look. And he kind of sort of did, but in a really kind of inconvenient way. This is an example where union sucks. So as a reminder, if I go through and run it for Alex or India up on the top with OR, and I look at the execution plan, we scan the entire table, but we only scan it once, and we find everything that we need. Mark says, wouldn't union all be closer? We're not doing union all here, we're doing a union, because you could have Alex who lives in India, and I don't want him showing up twice, therefore I got to use the union. So now if I do the union approach, I wish that SQL Server would use the index on display name and then use the index on location, but that's not what he does. What he chooses to do is he says, I'm going to do the two parts to the query. First, I'm going to look up all of the Alexes and I'm going to do key lookups for each of them. Then, at the same time, he's also going to scan the entire table again. So he ends up reading more pages than there are in the table in order to accomplish this operation. This is a great example of where union is actually worse. So in order to measure which one's better or which one's worse, the way that I prefer to do it is set statistics IO on. So if you run set statistics IO on, you'll be able to see over in the messages tab the total number of logical reads. Here, the OR approach does 143,000. And if I do the union approach, let's see. If I do the union approach, we end up with 172,000. So that at least shows you what the idea behind the union approach is and how to measure which one makes sense for your queries. All right, let's see here. Let's go back over and just a second here. Go back over and switch over to this monitor over here. And let's see what the next question is. So next up, Prasanna asks, can you explain about fill factor and how it affects performance? I can, but I'm going to need a piece of paper to do it. And I hate walking away and not leaving you with music, so hold on a second here. Let's go with... where's a piece of music that I have on here? Somewhere I've got a 60-second thing. Oh, it's there. Let's see here. Let's go grab a piece of paper out of the closet. And then get one of my How to Think Like the Engine demo pages. It's just so much easier to explain with a piece of paper in my hand. For all you know, I could be in the bathroom. Be making fun of you. All right, there we go. So almost everything that SQL Server does, it does in 8K pages, and you can kind of think of them as like pages printed out from a spreadsheet. So, he's in the closet. That's not bad. I see what you did there, G-Surgeon. So everything that it does in these 8K pages. These are the same units of data that are cached in memory and cached on disk. This is the smallest unit of data that SQL Server reads up from disk. This is the smallest unit of data that SQL Server caches in memory. There are some edge case differences around Hekaton, InMemory OLTP, column store, etc. Nicholas, I think that regular databases are best for people who can't read instructions that are printed up on the screen. That means you. I bet that hurts. Tell your friends. So given that this is the smallest unit, what fill factor means is how much empty space do you want to leave on each 8K page? People will say the default's 100%. By default, you want to pack in 100% of each page with good, juicy data. But it's amazing how people can't read. Isn't it amazing? It says right up there on the screen and they still can't read. It's especially true from the people from YouTube. Whew, those people from YouTube. And people from Dallas-Fort Worth. Oh, they're the worst. So here, with these 8K pages, do you want to leave empty space on each page? When you leave empty space on each page, what you're really doing is telling SQL Server, I want you to leave empty space in RAM. I want you to make every page have less data in it, which means that now my database is going to take up more space on disk, my backups will take longer, my index rebuilds will take longer, my update statistics jobs will take longer. If you want to scan a table, that's going to take longer. You're going to have less pages available in memory. Your linked server queries will run slower. I could go on and on and on. So I see some people who are like bloggers and performance tuners out there that are recommending people, hey, you should set fill factor to leave space on every page. And I love it. I love it because their customers then become my customers. Their customers, they go, oh my God, I hired this consultant and it didn't actually make anything faster and in fact made things worse. So I better go call someone who knows what they're doing. And that's how you end up at places like me, my YouTube channel and whatnot. So I often joke, that you probably shouldn't change settings on SQL Server unless you understand what their impact is. This is a great example of it. I see people in there monkeying around with SQL Server as if they're going to make it faster by randomly turning dials. There's a joke amongst the pilot community, people who are aircraft pilots. Modern aircraft are so advanced that they can even land themselves. So there's a joke amongst pilots that the current versions of brand new planes really only have two things in the cockpit. There's the pilot and there's a dog. It's the pilot's job to feed the dog. It's the dog's job to bite the pilot if he tries to touch anything. SQL Server needs a dog because there are all kinds of database administrators in there pushing all kinds of buttons that they don't understand, and they're making performance worse instead of better. Set fill factor back to the default, and don't change it unless you can prove that changing it makes things better, and it usually doesn't. It makes things worse. Next up, Jan asks, my friend uses a temp table or a table variable in a stored procedure. Is there any difference between table variables and temp tables? I didn't, oops, you slipped there, Jan. You're supposed to say your friend didn't see any difference while testing. There's a massive difference, and I talk about it in my fundamentals of performance or fundamentals of TempDB class tomorrow, but I'll give you a peek of it in the demo now. So what I'll say is I'll say create crit. I do that all the time. Create table. Oh no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say declare my friends table. Display name and varchar 40. Yeah, we'll just start with that. Insert into my friends, which sounds a little awkward. Display name, values. Bill Gates. And then say select star from my friends. If I run this query, at first it doesn't seem like there's anything complicated about it. The execution plan shows that I inserted a row, and if I come down here into select, if I hover my mouse over the select, SQL Server says estimated number of rows 1, actual number of rows 1. So far, so good. But if I put in a lot more values, like if I put in, say, Melinda Gates and Satya Nadella, and then run it. So now my temp table gets, or my table variable gets 3 rows back. If I look over at the execution plan, SQL Server only estimated that 1 row was going to come back out of an estimated possible or an actual number of 3 rows. So estimated number of rows 1, actual number of rows 3. Now, if all you're doing is dumping data into a table variable and pulling it back out, it doesn't really matter that much. Where it matters is when you take that table variable and you start to join it to other things, or you start to order the contents of it, anything that requires SQL Server to have an accurate estimate of how many rows are going to come back. That's where performance starts to collapse. The easy, better improvement is a temp table. Create table, my friends, insert into my friends, select star from my friends. If I execute this now, and I go look at the execution plan, now the number of rows estimated is 3. SQL Server accurately understood how many rows were going to come out of there. Because temp tables have statistics, table variables do not. So most of the time you want to use statistics. That's why you want to have table variables. There are all kinds of myths and urban legends around why temp tables are better or table variables are better. So to learn more about that, you can watch my Fundamentals of TempDB class. The first one's tomorrow, and after that you'll be able to watch the instant replays. And I go through the differences between temp tables, table variables, in-memory table variables, and then I explain to you when you would want to use each of them. True story, just literally on Thursday, Friday, the client that I was working with were having to change their temp tables into table variables for a very specific performance reason, which sounds kind of funny because most of the time you hear that that's a bad thing, but there are actually cases where it's a great thing, and that was one of those cases. So good question there, Jan. Let's see what we have next. Rihan says, is it better to have one large data file inside a file group or to have multiple relatively small files? Considering that the size of the database is large, in terabytes, what would you be recommending for all kinds of things? So I'm going to be brutally honest here. I always ask people, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Don't come to me with like specific features. What's the problem you think you're going to solve? And so when people think they're going to break things up across a whole bunch of very small files, but they're putting them on the same volume, they're not solving anything. What you might need to do is break up your I/O performance across several different volumes of storage or several different ways to connect to that storage. So for example, if you use Pure Storage, one of the most common things you'll hear is that you want to have like 4 virtual SCSI adapters so that you can have 4 different volumes, each with their own data files, and each volume needs to be pinned to a specific virtual SCSI adapter. That way you can get more throughput and you can saturate the Pure better. But unless you're looking at an end-to-end analysis of the SQL server, the database, the storage, the way that you're connecting to that storage, there are no best practices out there because every kind of storage is different. That's the really big thing that influences this, is the make and model of your storage. So you'll want to check with your storage admins, or if you're in the cloud, read the best practices for the kind of VM instance type that you're dealing with, and that'll help to factor that. But the simple example, depending on which kind of storage it is, like if it's Pure, you want 4 different virtual SCSI adapters, 4 paths to the storage, 4 different volumes, each volume pinned to a different SCSI adapter. Hi folks, and as a reminder to ask questions, go up to the top there and hit pollgab.com/room/Brento. That's where you can vote on questions, and I only take questions from there. Next up, the question that y'all voted the highest next is from Prasanna. Prasanna says, hi, what are the things that need to consider when I'm virtualizing SQL Server with Hyper-V? I don't think I have a lot of customers using Hyper-V. I don't actually know any best practices for Hyper-V because I don't have a lot of people using that. I think I've had one customer in the last 2 years that used Hyper-V. It seems like people who want to get cheap on virtualization, because essentially that's what Hyper-V is like getting cheap on virtualization. The clients who want to do that also tend to want to go to the cloud, or they tend to go bare metal, but so I don't actually know any best practices around Hyper-V. I also don't even know, hey, Barris, read the screen. Read that up top there. Instead of pasting multiple questions repeatedly, I'm going to go ahead and hide you from the channel for now, though. You know what? I'm just going to hide the chat altogether. That's what I'll do, so that way it just doesn't distract folks from the questions up there. That might make it a little easier. I can still see the chat over here, but just then that way it won't distract y'all. I'm just talking to you. You're brilliant. You're smart. You understand exactly what the directions are. It's those other people, and it's okay. They're not listening to me now anyway because I'm talking about the directions up on screen. As soon as I start talking about that, I'm like Charlie Brown's parents. Wah, 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 wah. They don't get it, but you and I appreciate you. You're charming. I think you even smell good today. Not that you don't always smell good, but you just smell better right now. So I don't have any good recommendations around Hyper-V, and I don't even have a good place to send you to on those, so that's kind of weird. Next up, the next highest voted one is from Mark. Let's see what Mark says. Mark says, I'm a longtime follower. Hey! I specialized early on T-SQL, but I feel the demand in that skill set is petering. What direction would you recommend going from there? You know, the best thing that I can tell you is I specialize in T-SQL. I'm doing all right. I'm getting ready to take a 3-week vacation in Mexico, like oceanfront place. at an obscenely expensive resort, I'm doing all right. And I think that you could actually do all right too with T-SQL. However, if you wanted to do something different, I would go to Python. Like I would learn Python because it's a language of data scientists and it's applicable across lots of database platforms, all kinds of stuff like that. So it has a wider appeal. However, I think you could coast out the rest of your career just doing T-SQL and make a pretty good living. That's exactly what I intend to do. Next up, Scott asks, when looking at statistics I/O, what's more important, logical reads or physical reads? Only logical reads. Physical reads are garbage and meaningless. Physical reads aren't even reproducible from one query to the next. It has nothing to do with performance tuning at all, period, full stop. And if I remember right, I believe that today's weekly links stream, or today's weekly links, actually has a link on why you shouldn't run DBCC drop clean buffers, about how SQL Server does a different kind of I/O if you do DBCC drop clean buffers, which is what I see people using sometimes to make physical reads be repeatable. It just isn't. So period, full stop. Only use logical reads. Just hitting a couple things that came up in chat that aren't related to questions. Christopher says, feedback, adding questions on PolGab would require me to leave the stream while on a phone. Would it be possible to add an integration between YouTube and PolGab, for example, using a hashtag? I wouldn't expect that. Like this is, PolGab isn't something that, I wouldn't expect that. I would follow instructions, Christopher. That's what I would do. But what do I know? It's just me. Next up, let's see here. Twitcher says, does CheckDB run on non-readable databases? Does CheckDB run on non-readable databases on a secondary, and how do you verify this? So what you do is you take a snapshot of a database. Anytime that you want to run a CheckDB against a log shipping subscriber that's read-only or is even in the middle of restoring, or like an availability group database, is you take a snapshot of it. The crappy part of that is that you have to be on Enterprise Edition, SQL Server Enterprise Edition, in order to take a snapshot. So that's kind of ridiculous. But you can. I mean, you can at least, if that's your goal, you absolutely could do that. So there you go. Next up, let's see, Sashan asks, have you ever come across a scenario where dropping auto-created column stats had improved performance? No, because SQL Server will create new statistics on a column if you run just one query. For some reason, early on in my life, I was under the impression that SQL Server would watch you querying on a column and would like wait several tries, like wait you see you make several queries against the column before it would add stats. And that's not what it does. It adds stats after the very first query on a column. So I've seen people think that they're going to reduce maintenance overhead if they drop some of those auto-created statistics, but because they just pop back so fast, it doesn't really help you at all there. Next up, Pias asks, how can I get started with Microsoft SQL Server? Is it free to use? Yes, you can go download SQL Server if you just Google for how to download SQL Server. The developer edition is completely free. Now, you're not allowed to use it for production uses, but if you're just using it for learning, developer edition's absolutely perfect, totally free. It says, can I use it on a Python application? Yes, you can use it as a backend for a Python app. The one thing I would say, though, is if you're building something as a hobby, be aware that putting SQL Server into production uses can be kind of expensive. There's an Express edition that's totally free, but it only uses 1 CPU core and 1 gig of RAM. So if I was going to pick a database to use for a Python app from the ground up, I'd probably go down the Postgres route, Postgres instead of SQL Server. Can I use it on Ubuntu? You can, you're just going to find hardly any good tutorials out there. And if you hit a stumbling block, you're going to have a hell of a bad time trying to figure out how to solve it. So again, I would try to pick the most mainstream thing possible. And if you're building Python apps on Ubuntu, you're going to find a lot easier tutorials out there and a lot more of them for MySQL and Postgres as opposed to Microsoft SQL Server. Shout out to this week's sponsor. So Quest is doing a webcast this week. They're doing an online conference on Wednesday. It's totally free to join. You can go register for it over at brentozar.com/go/quest. Adam says it's one socket or 4 cores. That's true, but each query only goes single-threaded. If I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the query processing is still just single core and it maxes out at 1 gig of RAM. 1 gig of RAM? My phone has more than 1 gig of RAM, so I always kind of find that kind of adorable. And also, to some extent, I think that Azure SQL DB is the new Express Edition. Azure SQL DB is cheap as hell to get started if you want to be a hobbyist, and then it's up 24 hours. Major says, I'm pretty sure database snapshots are available in Standard Edition. Oh, let's go see. Let's go take a look. So let's say SQL, oopsie daisy, SQL Server Standard Edition Snapshot. And let's see, that's a social post. Let's go over here. So database snapshots, let's come down to a search for enterprise. Nope, it's not on there. Prerequisites. The server instance must be running an edition that supports database snapshot. So let's click on that link, and then let's go down to snapshot. So database snapshot. Ooh, it looks like yes. There's a little 3 on there. I don't know what the 3 stands for. Let's go see and try it. Yes, yes. Oh, that's fantastic. Major Laser, nicely done. That's fantastic. That's actually really good to hear. So database SQL Server 2016 Service Pack 1. Now I want to go try that because that's kind of fantastic and awesome. All right, let's come back over to here. Next up, let's see what's next up on PollGab. Next up is saying, or next up, Joe says, some people are using Python for data analysis instead of T-SQL. Is Python overrated? What's better? Python is really the language of data scientists. If you're going to go to college and learn how to do data analysis, you're probably going to learn in things like Python and R. They're not going to teach you in an expensive proprietary language like T-SQL. So it's just that if you're coming out of college, you're probably already familiar, especially if you have stats degrees or anything like that. You're doing your work in Python. You're not doing it in T-SQL. Is Python overrated? I don't know because I haven't used it, but I tell you, everybody I know who does use it is like, oh my God, this is amazing. Now, if you're a database administrator, you don't need that. Francis, let's not give answers. Let's not give answers because Francis, you've got some learning to do. Let's hold off on that. Don't do that. Francis, if you could delete that comment, you probably should. So just because it's flat out wrong, period, full stop. Just don't put that in there. In terms of it being overrated, I'd like the people that I know who are using it. I actually like it quite a bit. So I don't see any problems with it. Next up, my friend asks, is Query Store more reliable in SQL Server 2019? Yes, but specifically SQL Server 2019 cumulative update 8. In one cumulative update, I can't remember whether it was CU 6 or 7 or 8, but I'm pretty sure that 8 has it, introduced a fix to a bug in Query Store where it essentially had a memory leak and it would use way too much memory. And so Aaron Stellato just published a good blog post this week. I'll show you Aaron's blog. So if we go search for Aaron Stellato blog, so Aaron Stellato of SQL Skills has a blog, and she just this week published a blog post about the overhead of Query Store And in here, she talks about the memory leak and all kinds of good stuff like that. Tells you how to mitigate the performance overhead of Query Store, things that you need to do in order to reduce that overhead and make it more reliable. Erin is the reason that I don't even try to record Query Store training classes, because hers are like the good resource for Query Store training. So she has training over at pluralsight.com. You can go grab it over there. Next up, let's see here. ZPM Fred says, have you seen InMemory OLTP used in production, and what is your opinion on it? Ooh, that's a good question. That is a good question. Let me prove a couple people flagged messages. I'm going to go clear those out of the queue. You know how you hear people say, like, if you don't have anything nice to say, you should probably keep your mouth shut. I don't have anything good to say about in-memory OLTP. There's one exception, which is in-memory OLTP table variables. In-memory OLTP table variables, fantastic. But in terms of using it for data storage, I don't have a lot of good stuff to say about that. I have had a couple of situations in my life where I'm like, you know what? This is actually a really good fit. And then we tried to use it and it burst into a pile of flames. So I don't have very high opinions on it. Yeah, two parts to your question. Have I seen it used in production? Yes. What's your opinion on it? Yeah. Other than the table variables, which I like quite a bit. Next up, Tom asks, what is your recommendation on setting max stop on VMs versus physical servers? It makes no difference whatsoever. To SQL Server, a core is a core. It makes no difference whether it's hyper-threaded or physical in terms of CPU scheduling. Don't overthink it. Just do it the exact same way on either of them. The KB article on that is 280/65/35. If you search for SQL Server 280/65/35, this is the KB article on how to configure MaxStop. It's gotten much better over the last few years, and it's really detailed these days, so it tells you how to set it in beautiful details. I wish that they would do that level of documentation for cost threshold for parallelism too as well. Next up, Drop Table Employees asks, what's your recommendation, or it says, will your move to Iceland impact the live training class schedule? No. Will the tone zone, the tone zone sounds like a rapper kind of place, like Tone Lokes plays there. The time zone difference probably won't be fun. You know what? It's really not bad. For Eastern time zones, my classes will just basically become 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. So the classes will be 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. Instead of in the mornings. And I'm just going to have to learn to adapt to deal with that. We've talked about doing, like splitting the classes into a morning session and an afternoon session. So right now my mastering classes are 3 days long. Well, what if, and they last all day, what if I turned them into 5-day long classes, but they were just either mornings or afternoons? So you got like Monday through Friday morning or Monday through Friday afternoon. And then what if I run them back to back? So let's say that I do mastering index tuning Monday through Friday. And on day one, I teach 4 hours in the morning, take a break, teach the same 4 hours again in the afternoon. So that way you could jump back and forth and see which one, depending on different days of the week, made more sense to your schedule. And I was talking about that with my wife, and she's like, so you're going to work twice as much? I'm like, well, yeah, probably not. So for folks who are asking questions, make sure you read the thing that's up there on the screen. That's first step to success is reading the instructions. Not all of you are going to be successful, but the instructions are up there on the top of the screen. Rui May asks, will you recommend using a unique identifier as a primary key, or doesn't it matter? There are times when you have to use a unique identifier as a primary key. I'll give you a great example. When you need to generate unique IDs client side without talking to the SQL server. So for example, one of my clients does handheld devices with sales, like they'll go and record the sales on a handheld device. They'll record sales all day long, and then they'll connect in because they're not near a cellular connection. They'll connect in, and then they need to push in all of their sales, and they want a unique identifier for each of those rows. And so unique identifiers make beautiful sense there. What I would say is I would only do it if you have to do it. Generally, an integer or a big int is a better primary clustered key, and a unique identifier is a worse clustered key. But if you do have to use it to like generate unique IDs client side, to handle multi-master replication going across lots of data centers, it works. It's just not quite as good from a performance perspective. Next up, Marcus asks, hi Brent, did you ever use peer-to-peer transactional replication? Yes, but not built into SQL Server. So there's a company that I worked at that had, speaking of like handheld sales devices, where every KDE, no, it's not nearly as bad. It's beyond what I can go into quickly in a video. But if you watch my video on defragmentation, I debunk the bejesus out of that. So I had a whole bunch of thousands of SQL servers that were each had thousands of salespeople that each had laptops, and they needed to be able to record sales and then also get back the status of their sales over time. So thousands of little bitty SQL servers, and then one master central SQL server that held everybody's orders and the statuses, and the warehouses ran off that, things like that. SQL Server's transactional replication would have totally blown chunks in that scenario. So my predecessor, I didn't architect this, my predecessor built a beautiful replication system with a web service basically, where we rolled our own, and it was so much easier to troubleshoot than SQL Server's peer-to-peer transactional replication. I've used peer-to-peer transactional replication. It's been a heartache for me when I've had to use it, and rolling our own has been just such a better long-term solution. Next up, for those of you asking questions over at pollgab.com, I'll go through the next question that was highly voted there. Barris says, hi Brent, how would you performance test or benchmark a SQL server? Very carefully. So the thing with performance testing and benchmarking is that every workload is different. Some workloads are CPU intensive, some are disk intensive, some are memory intensive, some involve blocking. Every one of them is different. So if you take a load test that isn't your own application and you run it, you might as well be running FizzBuzz. I mean, if you're just going to pick some random test and go run it, what good is that going to do you to know that this SQL server over here is good for 46 rabbits per second, and this one over here is good for 38 rabbits per second? Rabbits per second doesn't mean anything to you in your environment. The right way to do this is to have a repeatable workload test of your own code, the kind of application code that you and your users run. Oh my God, almost nobody does that. I mean, almost nobody. It's so hard to build a good repeatable load test for your own code because your code keeps changing. Your users keep getting new and different features inside of there. So it's not like it works the same exact way every single time. So how would I do it? Oh, I got all kinds of bad, weird settings on my camera there. So how I would do it, in reality, I go, well, are the developers able to replay an end-to-end load test? If not, it's really hard to do that. Oh, everybody wants an easy, just capture a production workload and replay it. But because production workloads change all the time with every new version of the app, it's really hard. Next up, Scott says, let's see here, says, why did that not show up? Oh, Scott says, my friend's boss asked, does SAN block sizes affect SQL Server performance very much? Is it ever worth changing block size for an existing SAN volume? So the problem with that is, as I like Srinivas says, my friend says, if the ask a question at the top is a different color, then people can look at that easily. Oh yeah, maybe I should blink it. Maybe I should have it in a marquee going across the top. Srinivas, I hate to bum you out, but that's probably not going to work either. People can't read. People don't care. And I would turn off question, or I would turn off chat like altogether, but then that's not fun because we have a lot of regulars who actually like to talk to each other. I think what's just going to happen is I'm just gradually going to get jaded, and I'm not even going to bother looking at, or I'm not even going to bother addressing the questions thing. I think I'm just going to let people flail in the comments. If they can't figure out how to read things on the screen, then that's kind of their own problem. So does block size affect performance? So let's say that it does. Let's say it does by 30%. Just to pick a number. It doesn't, but let's just say it does by 30%. How do you fix it? Well, you have to wipe out your entire existing volume, fix the block size, restore your databases, and go live again. What if I told you that you could gain 30% faster I/O performance by doing that? Would you do it? Most businesses still wouldn't do it. If it's only 30%, that's not a dramatic enough number in order to make a difference. In reality, the real performance is way lower. You're talking between 1 and 10% of max that it's ever been. And so because it's so invasive, it just doesn't really matter that much. Now, if you're building a brand new SQL Server from scratch, hell yeah, talk to your SAN vendor support team about what they recommend for Microsoft SQL Server. You may have to ask a few times. You may have to pull strings with the sales teams. You're not going to be able to Google and find a good result because they don't keep white papers up to date anymore for every different database. But if you get to the right people at the vendor, you'll be able to find someone who's done load tests and can tell you. And it's different for every kind of storage. Next up, Moshiko asks, I have basic SQL Server knowledge from college. Oh, did a collage. I've done collages too. I haven't really done them about databases, but they're really pretty. I have a bit of knowledge in Python. If I want to go into a back-end developer, how would you recommend to go into a back-end position? Oh, back-end position. Oh my goodness. Go apply. Oh, this is going to sound so crazy. Okay, so let me rephrase that. Because what I was going to say is right now it's really hard to find people who are skilled in the thing that people want to hire for. Like whenever an employer posts an ad, they get overwhelmed with resumes from people who have no idea what in the Sam hell is going on. Like they have no clue, no real qualifications. So they get overwhelmed with resumes. So what I was going to say is just go submit your resume anyway, and maybe you're going to get through. But what I would probably do is I would start networking with other people who have company jobs, and it doesn't even really matter if they have the job you want, but just start giving them your resume and go, hey, if you need a back-end developer, I'm interested and available. Like, here's my resume and because that way, if you're able to bypass the pile of resumes, you probably have a much stronger shot than some stranger off the street. I know it's not the answer that you're looking for. You're looking for us geeks. We're all antisocial geeks. We want to be able to complete a checklist on a computer and all of a sudden a job offer prints out on the screen, and it just doesn't work that way. People give jobs, so that's the tough part. Oh, wow. Good question. Why is Oracle more expensive than SQL Server? I'm going to give you several answers. Number one, it does more stuff, has more capabilities, runs at larger scale than SQL Server does. I know the SQL Server people don't like to hear that, but there is a history of building really large stuff on Oracle. Oracle is perceived as better, even if it isn't actually better, and I think it is. But even if it wasn't actually better, there's a wide perception that it is better. Kind of like how Burberry and Prada clothes cost way more than regular clothes. The nicer of a clothes that you go buy, it's because they're perceived as better. Not that they're actually going to last 100 years or make you look like a superstar. Another answer for that is that Larry Ellison owns a Hawaiian yacht or a Hawaiian island and a bunch of really nice yachts. And in order to pay for those, he has to charge a lot of money for that software. Another reason for it is that they tend to focus on enterprises. They tend to focus on really big environments, and really big environments have a lot of money. So hopefully that gives you a rough series of ideas as to why it's more expensive. Joe says, do you recommend SQL Server extensions? I think he means like weaves, maybe, like for longer hair. Joe, if you like longer hair, I wouldn't get extensions involving SQL Server. I'd just go get regular extensions. I mean, with the coronavirus, it's probably not the great time to go to the salon. You could, but there aren't any SQL Server extensions. You might be coming from a Postgres background, and Postgres has extensions. SQL Server does not. SQL Server, they build everything into the product, whether you like it or not. They kind of even throw in all kinds of things that you probably don't want. So it ends up being like a Swiss Army knife that has a forklift attached. A couple people in chat are saying SSMS extensions. I don't recommend any SSMS extensions because SSMS is barely reliable enough as it is. In terms of Management Studio, it barely hangs on together reliably. If you add in third-party stuff, it becomes even less reliable, so not quite so much. My mom says I am perceived as being a better mother. By who? Oh. Next up, Robbie says, hey Brent, as you know, reInvent 2020 is on. What do you think about the new EC2 instance type R5Bs? So 260,000 IOPS, I mean, it sounds like a lot, but it's not really a lot. You can buy a consumer grade SSD that outpaces that by like 3x or 4x. Plan Explorer isn't an extension for those of you who are pasting in. God bless you. This is the challenge of having viewers. A lot of you think you're more smart than you are. Plan Explorer is not an extension. And Richard, Plan Explorer is not sold by Redgate, sold by SentryOne. A lot of you would do. I'm bitter today. And I don't know if it's me or if the audience is doing even less Googling than they usually do. Because I'm recognizing some of your names and you're giving some of the worst answers. I think that some of you were just emboldened by Laser saying that he had the right answer about snapshots, and now a bunch of you are all trying to get involved with showing the right answer on screen. And Drop Table says I need a vacation. It's absolutely true. I do need a vacation. Oh, which reminds me also, this will be the last stream for like the next month because I teach for the next week and then we fly down to Mexico for 3 weeks and the bandwidth sucks down in Mexico. So you'll be missing me for a week. Jimmy says Brent needs a pour over. More caffeine is probably not going to help. Bob the Lobster points out maybe they're trying to wind me up because they like your rants. That also could also be true. So Robbie, back over on yours. 260,000 IOPS isn't really that big of a deal. You can buy a consumer grade SSD that pulls 1 million IOPS. So in relation to it, like the people that I know who needed IOPS need way more than 260,000. So they end up going with ephemeral storage instead, and they manage availability groups with lots of replicas that just keep the data safe across lots of replicas, but store the data locally on ephemeral, where you can smoke 260,000 IOPS. So I'm not that interested in it. I don't think it's that big of a deal. Next up, Chronicle says, in my corporation for ETL, we have a central server which periodically today is set. Do you think SSIS? Yes. Yeah, switch to SSIS. What you've got is best illustrated by the OK Go music video, This Too Shall Pass. So OK Go has a song called This Too Shall Pass. When you're done with the stream, go watch that. And that is a moving diagram of what your ETL process is today. You can show that to your peers and say, I designed a database diagram of what we're doing today using OK Go's This Too Shall Pass. SSIS is going to be a lot more intuitive, easy to manage, scalable, repeatable, restartable. So I would highly recommend that. Next up, let's see here. Michael, I guess it is, from Denmark, says if a primary key is a combined key, would you change it to a normal index and then a primary of int? Oh, that's a great question. Normally, when you change a primary key, it's so invasive. You have to drop all the foreign keys that relate to that table, then drop the primary key, then recreate a new primary key, then recreate all the foreign keys. It's so invasive. There's so much outage time and slow time involved with that it's extremely rare that I'll change somebody's primary keys because the overhead is just way too bad. So I don't do that. What I would say is when you go design a new table, if you can avoid using combinations of keys and go with single ones instead, that's usually better in terms of performance. But I would just never say to a client, all right, here's the deal. The most important thing we can do, the thing that's going to save our lives, is to redo our primary keys. And to do that, I'm going to need an 8-hour outage. Because if I can't measure an immediate difference after that 8-hour outage, I'm probably going to be in trouble. Next up, the next highest voted question over at PollGab is from Roberto. A network instance occurred while establishing a connection. All other clients connect fine. This is only on one client that I'm troubleshooting. Okay. So I'm going to give you I'm going to brain dump off the top of my head a bunch of things that could do this. And I could be wrong about any of them because you're going to have to check all of them. DNS resolution. You got to make sure that workstation can actually connect successfully to that SQL server, getting the right IP. It could have something like a host file in there that's redirecting, or a broken DNS, like the DNS server points to the wrong server. Windows firewall. You could have firewall set up in a way that bans outbound connections. Firewall on the SQL Server side. You could have SQL Server set up in a way that denies incoming connections from that IP. An alias. So in SQL Server, the drivers can have aliases where you type in one server name and it actually points you somewhere else. So those would be the first places that I'd start. Make sure that you actually get the right IP and that there's no firewall in between you and the SQL server. So because any of those things can totally wreak havoc on that. That's where I would start. Next highest voted question over on PollGab is from Roman. Roman says, hi Brent, I'm copying jumbo files out of the SQL server. Could that put memory pressure on SQL server? Absolutely. I've seen unbuffered copy suggestions to avoid this, but it looks like something that happened on old versions of Windows. No, it happens on current versions of Windows as well. Generally, don't use SQL Server as a file server. Don't copy paste things around from SQL Server. If you're doing things like needing to move backups, when you write the backup, write it where it needs to go, like write it to a UNC path rather than writing it locally, so that way you don't have to do the Rube Goldberg thing of copy pasting files all around. But you're absolutely right, and you have the right keywords that you're searching for. If you had to do filed copies, what you would want to do is use Xcopies unbuffered file copies, and then that way it won't put memory pressure on SQL Server. Next up, TMRDBA. TMRDBA says, what is your take on high thread pool weights? Max threads 7,000 is never hit. 7,000? 200 CPUs, 208 CPUs. Oh, coincidence. Oh, okay. This is way beyond what I would troubleshoot live on a webcast. This is totally the kind of thing where consulting gets involved. So if you want to hire me for consulting, go to brentozar.com and click consulting up at the top of the screen. I don't know why I'm pointing. For those of you watching on brentozar.com, it's probably right about there. So go to consulting, and I'm busy during the weekdays, but I do have weekend availability starting in January. That is exactly the kind of thing that people would call me for. If you don't want to call me, I totally understand. You could open a support case with Microsoft. It's going to be $500, and they work the problem with you until it's done. The reason why I say that is at 208 CPU cores, my math is really bad, but exactly, Adam's going to the licensing cost. if I go to 208 CPU cores, so calculator, 208 times $7,000, that's $1.5 million worth of licensing. If you can afford $1.5 million worth of licensing, A, you can hire me, but B, you can certainly afford to call Microsoft for support for $500. Quit screwing around asking questions on a Twitch stream. Go actually open up a support case because it's totally worth it. All right, one more before we go to our bio break. So the next up, John James says, I've been using Who is Active and First Responder Kit. Any cons on doing it like this as opposed to the defaults? We were told we couldn't add stored procs to prod servers. Oh yeah, no, I know a lot of consultants who do that. I know a lot of consultants who create them as temporary stored procedures and run them that way. No downsides whatsoever. Totally okay. I would do that same thing if I were in your shoes. So totally all right. All right, a quick shout out to this week's sponsor. This week's sponsor is Quest Software, who's doing a database virtual summit this week. On Wednesday, they have an all-day webcast with 3 different tracks. If you want to go learn more about that totally for free on hybrid cloud, database optimization, and more, you can go register over at brentozar.com/go/quest. So that you can go do that now while we're going to go do a bio break. I'm going to go take a 5-minute bio break. I'm probably going to do something ill-advised. I'm going to go make more espresso, which probably means that after the break, I will either be more of a ranting and raving. Now, to be fair, this was actually decaf. This one's actually decaf, but it's because I was up at 2 a.m. this morning. So and that's not unusual for me. I'm very normally up at 2 a.m. in the morning, but I have an emergency client this weekend, and so I started writing their findings again. I was writing their findings all afternoon and then started writing their findings again this morning, and I'm done. Woo! I'm done. So I was drinking espresso while I was doing that, so I had to switch to decaf here later on when it came time for you fine people. I don't want you thinking that my ranting is like based on the caffeine level. It's probably a genuine need for vacation is probably what it is. All right, so we will take a 5-minute bio break. Get your questions in at PollGab. So those of you who want, Adam says, I'm going to put the chat back up on screen because this is kind of funny. Adam says, I am too, normally up at 2 a.m., but that's because I haven't gone to bed, though. My wife and I are starting to get to the point where we're crossing streams. Like, she goes to bed at, like, midnight, and 2 a.m. I wake up, so it's kind of funny how that works out. So if you want to get your questions in, go over to pollgab.com/room/Brento. You can vote the questions that we'll go tackle on our after the next break. So 5-minute bio break, and I will be right back. Let's see. Welcome back, party people. So welcome back to the stream. I was laughing over the break. Oh yeah, sure. Can I post a WebEx log again? So that's over brentozar.com/go/quest. Over the break, I was laughing as I was making my espresso. I was like, you know what I should really do is I should put tequila in there or whiskey. I have one of those whiskey advent calendars, and there is no way I'm going to finish that thing. It's like one whiskey bottle per, they're tiny bottles, like a shot and a half kind of thing. But it's one whiskey bottle per day for the entire advent. We're gone for a lot of advent down in Mexico. So there's no way that I'm going to be able to finish that thing. So I thought, well, I should put one in the coffee, but I know my wife will smell it. You and I would have a really funny time laughing about me doing whiskey at like 7 a.m. in the morning as I was dealing with YouTube questions. But my wife would wake up and she'd be like, Brent, I think you have a problem. Especially given that, well, true, I have a client call at noon my time, so that would probably be bad. I Drive Faster says, should I come by and pick them up? I think I'm going to give them to my building staff just because I think it's really funny. They're like drug size bottles, like as if I'm a drug dealer, and be like, here you go. These are insanely good whiskey. Wow, a drunk history version of Office Hours. That would be amazing. Oh, I would love that. Oh my God, that would be so funny. There was a point in time when Eric Darling worked for me, there was a point in time where we were talking about doing, what was it that we were calling it? It was like drinks and databases or drinks with the DBA. There was something along those lines. And so we were talking about, like taking a nice bottle of something and then just doing a round. Richie says, no, exactly. I know, right? It could go so badly, especially with, I'm kind of risque to begin with, and I'm sure that I would be dropping F-bombs left and right. I would be saying things that would really permanently offend a lot of people on the SQL Server team or out in the community, just because, of course, you get drunk and you say things that you're going to regret. So it's one thing talking about history, but it's another thing talking about databases like the stuff that you work with. That could go really south, but I would really enjoy that. To some extent, that's what our company retreats used to be. All right, so we have a ton of questions. I'm tempted to turn off questions. I'm going to do that. I'm going to hit stop taking questions just so that y'all can vote on what we'll talk through for the rest of the hour. So your votes over at pollgab.com/room/Brento will determine the questions that I go through, because I think there's more than I could possibly hit. I'll let y'all vote on the ones that you want to see. Joe says, could you make an office hours on the beach? The bandwidth is so bad in Cabo, Mexico, that I couldn't. I've actually tried that. I couldn't even do a client WebEx out there. So like video and audio this good, no way it would work. What I could do is I could gather, to some extent, I could gather a list of questions and then work through those questions on the beach. But like doing it live wouldn't work. And that doing it live is what's so much fun of it. Even when I'm making fun of y'all with the chat, I mean, to me, it's the highlight of my morning. Not that I need a lot of highlights in the morning. Things are going kind of well. So let's see here. The next question that came in was from Bandar, and I like that quite a bit. QBLA, exactly. Bandar says, would you comment on Windows authentication on SQL authentication in terms of security? Most auditors consider SQL authentication a finding. The bummer about SQL authentication is we've all been in that shop where everybody copy pastes around the SA password. It's like up on Post-it notes on monitors and everybody uses it, or they have an application login, but everybody knows the login and password. That's why auditors usually consider it a finding. If you treated Windows logins the same way, Windows logins would be considered a finding. But usually for auditors, it's just a shorthand of, hey, you shouldn't be doing that. Instead, have a Windows login per service and per person. Just be aware that you can violate best practices with Windows logins just as much as you do with SQL logins. For a while, it looked like Microsoft was going to deprecate SQL logins, but then when they started up Azure SQL DB, they were like, oh yeah, this doesn't work with Active Directory, and then they had to go ahead and leave SQL logins in because that's all they had for quite a period of time. Next up, Sachin says, when I'm tuning a problematic query, is it correct approach to first jump on an operator which is showing the most cost relative to the query, or should I follow a different approach? That is completely and utterly and wildly incorrect. Like, not even close. But God bless you. I don't blame you for thinking that that's the right answer. I don't blame you for thinking that that's the right answer, because that's kind of what it looks like it should be, but it is wildly incorrect. I talk about why over in my Fundamentals of Query Tuning class. So let me go grab one demo out of there. I'll do one demo just to show you what's going on with that. Go Query Fund. And then, oh, actually, you know what? It's even better. It's 21 demos. Let's get that one out and pull this demo out, copy this out, and go over into SQL Server Management Studio, paste that in, and then go into there, and then make a query here real quick, and then set this up. Get this all set to go so that I can run it and then show it to you. Did I do that too fast? I probably did that too fast. Hold on a second. This is why I do it off screen, so that you don't see me flailing around like some kind of moron. I am a kind of moron. That just is how that works. Delete that, and then delete that. Delete all of that. And then there we go. So here's what I got. I got two queries inside here. And the contents of the queries don't really matter, but I just want you to know that I have two queries up on the screen. I'm going to hit Control L to get their estimated cost. If I hit Control L to go get their estimated cost, SQL Server is going to go build an execution plan. He's not running the query. All he's doing is building an estimated query plan. Now, it's also a little bit on the slow side here, because this is the first time that I've done an estimated query plan on this database sensor restore. So now I have two queries inside here, remember, two queries up at the top. Here's query number one, here's query number two. Now, if I look at their two execution plans, you see the one on the top costs 100%, the one on the bottom costs 0%. So it would seem like if you're going to tune something, it should be the query up on the top. Query up on the top has these big giant Lincoln logs going in between operators. It would seem like the one that you would want to tune would be the one on the top. But now let's run them. 3, 2, 1, execute. First query's done. Second query is still going. The second query is still going. Second query is still going. The costs are what SQL Server estimated before the query ran. The costs are not updated in the actual plans. You don't get an updated actual plan that shows you how much what the cost was. So it says, what about the actual plan? The costs on the actual plan are the same as the costs on the estimated plan. There is no cost on actual plans that's actual. It's only the estimated costs from before the query ran. So in my class in Fundamentals of Query Tuning, I take that exact query and I show you, I go back and forth between the two, I show you why the execution plans are wrong. But the costs are utter garbage. They mean nothing. Sachin says, I meant in a single query. Correct, remember, but remember that top query said it had a big giant cost? It didn't. And the operators were all completely incorrect. Just to drive the point home, I'll show you. So this other query finished. The other query took like 1:21 altogether. Now, Sachin, going up on yours, if we look up at the top, so which one had the high cost in all of this? Well, Sachin, it looks like this one right here was 99%. 99% is pretty high, right? I'm not a big data scientist, but 99% of the cost would seem like a fairly big deal. But you know what? That operator didn't even run. Because look at the actual number of rows that went into that operator, 0. No operators did, or no rows did. The only reason that that thing has a cost of 99% is that SQL Server thought that the cost was going to be that high, but costs aren't updated on actual plans. Costs, all the percentages, still show the estimates from before the query ran. When you hover your mouse over here, these words for cost, they still say estimated. They don't say actual. You'll never see actual costs on an execution plan. So those numbers are simply garbage and utterly meaningless. They mean nothing, period, full stop. So you said, should you follow a different approach? Yes, and I teach you the approach in my Fundamentals of Query Tuning class. So you can check that out. Those of you who caught in on the Black Friday sale can go in and grab that. Polyphonic says, gutted. Next up, Joe over on Polgab says, what are the features of a great database structure? I'm going to take a philosophical answer. It's easy to write queries to get the data that you need in a quick period of time. That you can write the queries quickly and they perform quickly. That, for me, is the features of a good database structure. I'm less about armchair perfection. Well, I believe that you need exactly third normal form, not fourth normal form, not second normal form. It has to be third normal form. I'm much less about the academics of that. Is it easy for the business to get the data in and out quickly? And quickly defines both the process of which they wrote queries and also the experience in how those queries write, or how quickly those queries perform. So that for me is the big threshold there. Next up, Joe says, what is PowerShell? Is it better than Management Studio? PowerShell is a scripting language that helps you accomplish tasks not just in SQL Server, but in other platforms. If you want to administer Windows, IIS, any kind of Microsoft tools or third-party tools, PowerShell helps you accomplish that. To some extent, it's kind of like Python or VB Script. It's a scripting language. SQL Server Management Studio is an application that lets you manage servers, but it's a GUI. It's not real. It's a graphical user interface. It's not really about managing lots of servers at scale. So it's kind of like you're asking, what is a carrot? Is it better than a knife? They're just totally different tools. Next up, Anurag says, is it good to use with recompile in a stored procedure in order to avoid parameter sniffing? The problem with recompile is that every time your query runs, SQL Server is going to build that brand new execution plan, and that takes CPU time. Let's go take a look and see what I mean by that. So if I look at this execution plan that we ran over here, if I right-click on this select and I go into Properties and I look at, say, the compile CPU. Let me move this just a little bit so that I can let it show up on the screen there. There we go. So compile CPU. In order to build this execution plan, SQL Server spent 3 milliseconds of time on CPU. Now that's not really that bad. 3 milliseconds is not a lot of CPU. Or is it? Dun, dun, dun. Let's take that just a little bit deeper. If I say 3 milliseconds of CPU to build a plan, and let's say that the query that you run runs 100 times per second, that means that your server is going to spend 300 milliseconds of CPU time every second just compiling. Just compiling the execution plans. He's going to spend 300 milliseconds of time every second just compiling that one query. Where option recompile backfires is that people put it in the first time and they're like, this solves parameter sniffing. It's great. Let's start using it everywhere. And then they gradually copy paste it into more queries and their CPU is rising and rising and rising. And then eventually they call me. Boss calls me and is like, oh my God, we're spending all this money on SQL Server licensing. Can you help? And I open up the performance metrics and I see that your server is spending all its time compiling CPU or compiling queries. And I go, oh, you know what? Looks like somebody figured out how to use option recompile and they started putting it in every query. Unfortunately, that means you've got 100% CPU. And then your manager says, well, how do we fix it? And I say you have to start taking out option recompile or you have to start buying more expensive servers. And that's the point where your manager turns to you and goes, who did this? Whose bright idea was this? And I'm going to teach you something very important. You always say it was the last guy. It was never your idea. It was always the last guy's, right? It's just like what we say on the webcast whenever you want to post an answer that you're not sure whether or not it's correct. Frankly, even if you think it is correct, you should say, my friend says it was never your idea. Because your ideas, if they're anything like my ideas, are usually bad. Wish that I was joking on that. Ned Scott, exactly. My friend did it. It wasn't even my friend, really. I didn't really like him that much, but he was drunk and he had a gun. So I just had to do what he said. And I did other things, but we're not going to talk about those. Nad says, in my environment, we have availability groups, and almost all the servers max stop is 0. My question is, I know we need to configure, but I don't see any issue. Do we have to configure while we're not getting any issues? Oh, that's a great question, Nad. That's a really, really good question. Nad, if I had to give you like a bonus for that question, that's fantastic. You did a great job of understanding that there's a risk involved with making that change. If people aren't happy, change equals risk. So here's the thing. If you set max stop, because right now it's unlimited, if you set it, you're going to set it to lower. What if you have some queries that are right now actually using all the cores, and all of a sudden they can't? Now all of a sudden we turn down max stop to like, turn down for what? Turn down max stop to like 8 or something. All of a sudden you could have queries that are running slower because they get less CPU power. So you know what, Nad? I'm actually with you. I would wait until you have a problem that you need to solve and then evaluate whether or not that change makes sense. On new servers, though, if you build new servers from the ground up, that's where I would change cost threshold and max stop to be a more appropriate number, just so that you don't get into future problems instead. Next up over at PollGab, the next highest voted question is from Sudhir. Sudhir asks, I have a query that has an unpredictable runtime between 3 seconds and 40 seconds. There's no blocking and no parameters, same variable and same query plan. The query is asking for 66 megabytes. Is the unpredictable runtime due to excessive memory grants? The server may be under memory pressure. I don't think it is with 66 megabytes. 66 megabytes isn't big data by any means. Also, Sudhir, I need to say that you put so much good information into 280 characters. That's the stuff that you put in is exactly the stuff that I would want to look at in your shoes. So good job there, especially around no blocking and there aren't parameter differences. So dear, what I expected is, I'm not 100% sure, but what I expected is unbalanced parallelism. That SQL Server from time to time isn't handling parallelism appropriately and the work is all ending up on one thread. If you have my live class season pass, go to the mastering server tuning class and watch the abnormal parallelism module. You don't have to watch the rest of the class first. This is one of those that you can jump directly into that one and start pulling your hair out following along. So that's in Mastering Server Tuning. Abnormal parallelism is where I cover that particular problem, because that's the thing that I think it is. You can also see it if you run the query and look at the number of rows in each operator. Let me show you how to do that. So if I say select star from DBO users, U inner join DBO comments C on UID equals C user ID. Let's create an index to create index user ID on DBO comments user ID. And then I'll say where U location equals Reading, United Kingdom. That should do it. And we'll put the n in there just to make it really good. Okay, so if I've been living my life right, this query is going to go parallel. If you have not been living my life correctly. So let's go look. It did not. Oh, that's excellent. I might have screwy. Oh, the cost is kind of low. Hold on, let me switch one thing in. Order by C creation date. And we'll go top 1000. Let's see if that goes parallel the way that I think it's going to go parallel. That did not go parallel either. It's kind of funny how that works. Okay, let's do this. India. And then execute. Let's see if you do. Yes. Okay, that's perfect. Okay, so what I've got here is, if I highlight the parallelism operator, the way that queries work is we work from right to left, top right to top to bottom. So the first thing that happened was that SQL Server did a clustered index scan across the users table. But you see the racing stripes in there on the parallelism or on the clustered index scan operator? That means that this thing went parallel. It divided the work across multiple threads. Now, let's look at the properties of that to really understand what happened. If I right-click in here, go into Properties, and I look at the I/O statistics, move around a little here, and let's hide the question for a second. There we go. And then move this back over here. Let's hide the chat too as well, just so that I can finish teaching this answer. And then I'll move in over here and zoom in. So here, SQL Server broke the work across 4 threads. I said that everything in SQL Server stored in 8K pages. Well, each of those threads got roughly the same number of pages. It's not perfect, but roughly the same number of pages. Where do the people in India live? Your guess is as good as mine. They should be evenly, kind of, sort of distributed out across these pages. Well, were they? Let's scroll down and let's look at the number of rows for all executions. And they're decently evenly balanced. It looks like each thread found roughly the same number of users. Najim, it's 2019. But everything I'm describing here has been the same since SQL Server 2000 at least. So now here's where parallelism starts to get a little weird, because really everything all the way up to that parallelism operator over there is all divided across multiple threads. But if you on this one particular thread find, say, 4,000 users, then you're going to go look up each of your 4,000 users' comments. And some people talk more than other people, as we know from watching the chat. If I right-click on this index seek and I go into Properties, and then I look at the work that was distributed across each of the cores, here in this case, the people from India looks like they talk roughly a similar amount. And if we look at the number of comments that we found, they all left a roughly similar number of comments. Adam, nicely done, Adam from Sweden. They all left a roughly similar number of comments. So we're going to end up doing a roughly similar number of key lookups and a roughly similar amount of sorting. If I right-click on the sort, go into Properties, I can see the number of rows that were sorted for each of the threads. It's not perfectly balanced, but it's just kind of sort of balanced evenly enough. This is how parallelism is supposed to work. But I bet in your environment, let's go turn on the poll gab again there. So who was the name of this? It was Sudhir. So Sudhir, I bet in your environment, what you're going to find when you run this query is that you're going to see different numbers of rows. And sometimes when it goes poorly, all of the work is going to be pinned to one poor thread that's going to have it be doing all of the work. And it is going to be different every single time the query runs. So to fix that, that's where I talk about the details of how to fix it over in the Mastering Server Tuning class in the Abnormal Parallelism module. But tons of fun. I really enjoy that one. Those are one of my favorite demos too. Steve said, well, what do the top weight types might look like on a perfectly tuned server? Steve, you assume I've ever seen one. So this is a really interesting question. You could say, in theory, that there wouldn't be any wait types. That if you had a truly unlimited amount of hardware horsepower and beautifully tuned queries, that you wouldn't have any waits whatsoever. But in reality, if you had that kind of setup, you know what managers would say? Sweet mother of God, we're spending too much money on hardware and licensing. Will someone please get our costs under control? And then eventually you'd start backing down the amount of horsepower that you have. Also, +2, when you say a perfectly tuned server, that implies a perfectly trained group of staff managing the server, enough staff managing the server, and perfect hardware underneath it. So in reality, what ends up happening is, I should put the chat back up on screen too. So in reality, what ends up happening is that the business makes compromises and is willing to tolerate some waits, but just not enough that that end users are getting hammered. I'll give you a great example. So one of the clients I worked with recently had write log waits out the wazoo. Write log is whenever you're doing inserts, updates, and deletes, and we have to write to the transaction log. They had write log waits out the wazoo, but the average duration was only like 10, 12 milliseconds. People weren't noticing and complaining about their transactions taking 10, 12 milliseconds longer. So as far as this client was concerned, they were completely okay with those waits because they weren't end user facing in a duration that really made any kind of sense. So it's a great question, but that's why you don't see answers out there to that particular question. Next up over on PollGab, let's see here what the next highest voted question was. The next highest voted question is from Luke. Hi Brent, in a single server with 4 cores, we have SQL Server and SSIS. Can we prioritize? Luke, my phone has 8 cores. Maybe we try not packing so many clowns in the car. If you're worried about sharing resources across 4 cores, go get yourself an iPad. Go get yourself something else to go run those. Don't worry about prioritizing one over the other, because you know what SSIS is doing? It's calling SQL Server. They both need to run at the same time. So don't try to micromanage things when it's that tiny. If you're really that worried about CPU, go use a separate VM, because I know it's a VM. It's not a real bare metal box with only 4 cores. That would be a phone. Next up, Richard says, if we wanted to capture stored procedure parameters, would InMemory be well suited to that? No. Extended events would be. Eric Darling's extended events is beautiful for that. So if you look at SP Human Events by Eric Darling, it will sample stuff into SQL Server's memory space in extended events. You don't have to screw around with a table or anything like that. Works so beautifully. I just absolutely love it for that. SP Human Events. I use that in training classes too. Oleg says, what libraries do you think are good to extend SQL Server's capabilities, like the First Responder Kit, SQL Sharp, or perhaps other? When you say extend capabilities, the First Responder Kit doesn't really extend SQL Server's capabilities. It extends your capabilities as a database administrator. There are so many things to extend your capabilities. I would not install things in SQL Server to extend its capabilities. I have seen so many people install something in SQL Server thinking they're going to make it faster, and they have made things spectacularly bad. So just be really careful when you're like, I'm going to add a nitrous bottle in here, because often it backfires pretty badly. Now, what to improve your own capabilities? What do I recommend? Obviously, the First Responder Kit, because that's what I use. SP Who Is Active is fantastic. Eric Darling's SP Get Human Events. Ola Hollengren's maintenance solution. DBAtools.io if you know PowerShell. There's a repo full of stuff, actually. If you find binders full of, if I search for Kteranov GitHub, Kteranov, Konstantin has this repository full of stuff with blogs, GitHub scripts, trace flags, all kinds of things. It's really nice, and because it's open source, you can go contribute other things to it, and I've contributed things to it too. So I'll go ahead and click on that. And then he has this SQL Server Kit repo, and there's so much stuff in here, it's not even funny. So there's just an insane amount of free things inside here that you can use. So that's Konstantin Taranov, K. Taranov. Really good stuff. Next up, let's see here. Oh, Varen asks a good question. Do you think it's absolutely necessary for production DBAs to know PowerShell? Varun, that's a great question. That's really, really good. Varun, I would say not absolutely necessary because some production DBAs only manage a few servers. Like at some of my clients, they only have 2, 3, 4 SQL servers, and they're able to do really well even without PowerShell. Like they're really sharp DBAs. However, what I would say is if you're going to make a long-term living doing production database administration, you'll be more powerful and more valuable on a longer term if you start learning PowerShell. So that's the way that I would answer it, is if you're going to make a living doing it. Now, here's the part I'm going to say that's going to piss people off. I don't recommend making a living doing it. I don't recommend making a living doing production database administration 10, 20 years from now. I don't think that there's going to be a lucrative career keeping the lights on as a production database administrator. By production database administrator, what I mean is making sure that the service is up, that it's patched, that you can fail over quickly. Because I think that more of it, yeah, Adam nails it. The robots are coming for our jobs. The robots move real slow. Right now, it's easy to kick them and kind of make fun of them. But the robots are coming for production DBA jobs. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen 5 years from now. But I said 10 to 20 years from now, I would want to be out of that space. So I don't think it's going to be a high value space. I think it's going to be more like car mechanics. Car mechanics used to make a killer living, they have great job security, but these days so much more of that is computerized that it's less common to find shade tree amateur mechanics, and now mechanics are really a specialized career. It's a specialized profession. So, and though you can make great money still being like an old school Ferrari mechanic working on analog hardware, but just way less of them. Next up, Marcus asks, for syncing logins inside of availability groups. Why did that not, hold on a second. Let me see if I can refresh that little display there. I got a little button under here where I can refresh that. And okay. There we go. For syncing logins inside availability groups, is it any good to use self-contained databases? I don't think so. I think that's one of those stillborn features where Microsoft thought they had a good idea on their hands, and then right after it came out, they went, oh yeah, no, this doesn't actually work at all. And then they kind of gave up on it. And they don't deprecate it because it's one of those things that hasn't been so urgent that they need to rip it out. But I haven't seen $1's worth of improvements hit anytime recently. So I wouldn't go down that solution. Really, that's kind of my opinion about a lot of features. It's rare that I'll use a feature when it first comes out. What I'll usually do is wait for the next version of SQL Server and see whether Microsoft improved it at all. But if they just launch something and they're kind of like, moving on now, then that's one of those where I would not go after. PollGab is grayed out because we're only answering the questions that have already come in at this point. We're coasting down the last 20 minutes of the webcast. Next up, let's see here. Darman asks, midweek without any changes on table or data volume, identical query, scan went to 1%, made the query cost, can recommend a starting point to research. Yeah, so what you might have missed, or you probably typed this after I had the demo just a minute ago, that costs are garbage. Costs are utterly meaningless. They make no difference whatsoever. What happened was you got a different plan. It's not just that the cost changed, you got a different plan, like a new plan generated. So what you would want to do instead is you would want to go through my fundamentals of query tuning class where I show you how to compare two execution plans. Get the original execution plan, get the new execution plan, review the changes. And the changes aren't just the costs are kind of irrelevant. Next up, SQL says, do you see resource Oh, James Roland Jones, JRJ, good to see you, sir. Do you see resource governor being used much in the real world? And if so, why? Yes. And I'm going to give you, when it first came out, I did not. But since the last like 3-4 years, it has been ravingly useful. And the ways that it's been useful have been kind of odd. Number one, tracking who's using the database. So sometimes people will cram a whole lot of users and applications into the same SQL server, and then they'll ask the question of who's screwing the server, like who's using up all the resources. Resource Governor is wonderful for that because what you can do is set up workload groups and workload pools and then track with the DMVs who's using the most CPU, who's using the most IO, who's using the most memory. It's great for costing, and I've also been able to settle arguments amongst teams to go, no, look, we can prove that it's this team that's using the most resources on the server. You don't actually throttle them. You don't actually throttle them. You just use the resource governor for tracking. Second place that it's incredibly useful is InMemory OLTP. Osman, we're not, I understand that you're desperately needing me to save your life, but we're not going to answer that today. Thanks for understanding. The other place that I've seen it really useful is InMemory OLTP. With InMemory OLTP, there's no built-in cap on how much memory Hekaton uses. So it's up to you to bind Hekaton databases to specific resource groups and then cap how much memory each database uses. So that's absolutely wonderful as well. Next up, Joe asks, my work colleagues have 10 years of SQL Server experience. How can I catch up with them fast? Some people, there's a funny speaker in the SQL Server community, Buck Woody, who likes to say that some people have 10 years of experience, but some people just have 1 year of experience that they've done 10 times in a row. They keep doing exactly the same thing. So one of the best things that I could recommend is making sure that you're getting different experience, that you're tackling different things. If you come to work every day and you do exactly the same thing in the same way and you haven't learned anything, then you don't really have 10 years of experience. And a lot of times people are actually doing that. Those people with 10 years of experience are just growing moss all over them because they're not changing. Experience junior is a great way of saying it, Peter. I like that a lot. What I would say is if you only have a limited number of servers at the shop and you're not really going to get a whole bunch of different experience, this is going to sound goofy, but I would go answer forum questions. I would go to places like dba.stackexchange.com, stackoverflow.com, and SQLServerCentral.com and try to push yourself into answering other people's questions with proof. Boy, I tell you what, nothing teaches you whether or not you know something like trying to solve someone's problem, because they will pick your answer apart. They'll be like, nope, that's not right, or I tried this, or whatever. And then so that will really help you get more experience and also help you answer a wide variety of topics. Another thing that you can do is share, give back to the community. I'm not saying you have to do a Twitch stream or YouTube stream or anything like that, but by giving back to the community, doing presentations, do lunch and learns for your team. And when you have to stand up in front of a group and teach something, that teaches you to really dive deeply into that topic so that you'll be able to answer the questions. Because we all feel like imposters. We all have that imposter syndrome kind of thing going on where we don't really believe that we know it. If you get up in front of a group of people and you're able to talk about it, that will prove that you know it, especially if your coworkers aren't doing that. And then we'll take one last question. The last one that we'll take, the last highest voted one over at PollGab was... Let's go hide these chat questions here for a second. The next highest one was, I don't know that it's showing. PollGab isn't showing. PollGab isn't updating. All right, so that may be the last one that we'll take. Okay, so I'll read the last one out loud. The last one is someone, maybe me, has deleted an important table from the database. Is it possible to recover this table alone and see who did it? Are there changes kept somewhere? Yes, in the transaction log. SQL Server's transaction log stores all that stuff, but you'll need a transaction log reader in order to do it. So like Quest Lightspeed, Apex SQL Log Reader, these third-party tools have the ability to read the transaction log and then give you reports based on it. But I got to tell you, they're slow as molasses. They're really slow in a production environment where all kinds of things are happening on the server. It can take hours in order to go through a real SQL Server transaction log and get you that information. The other part of that was, can you restore only just this one table alone? Unfortunately, no. SQL Server doesn't have table level restore. I've asked for it though. If you want to go see, if you go to feedback.azure.com. If you go to feedback.azure.com, let me go get rid of that over there. Go to feedback.azure.com, and on the right-hand side, scroll down through the list and go to SQL Server. If you click on SQL Server there, you get the top voted requests for SQL Server. And what do you know? The number 3 most highly voted request is right there, restore a table from backup. So over at feedback.azure.com, you can go vote for the features that you want, and then Microsoft will ignore you the same way that they ignored me. So that will be it for this week's stream. My coffee shop downstairs is about to open, so I'm going to go put in my order and then stumble my way downstairs because this is the last day that restaurants are open in San Diego County, so I got to go through and get that while I still can. So a warm round of thank yous over to Quest. Our Quest for our sponsor for this week, brentozar.com/go/quest, has a free database summit webcast this week, so you can go watch 3 tracks over there and then learn about hybrid cloud, performance optimization, all kinds of cool stuff. So you can go over to brentozar.com/go/quest. And I will go get my coffee, and this will be the last one for the next, this will be the last Q&A stream for the next couple of weeks because I'm going to go teach classes all this week. I teach my fundamentals of TempDB class. Oh, let me put the chat back up there so that y'all can see it. So I teach my fundamentals of TempDB thing this week on Monday, and then I teach mastering index tuning Tuesday through Thursday. I'm curious how many of y'all are coming to mastering index tuning, because I know a bunch of y'all bought live class season passes or the level bundles during Black Friday. It'll be interesting to see how many of y'all are going into that. Adam says, will it even be the last stream of the year? It will. I'm spending New Year's Eve down in Cabo as well, so I won't be. Oh, Mossy Moss is in here. Very cool. Drop table employees. Oh, very cool. So that's the first live mastering class I know for a lot of y'all. We'll be doing that on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Make sure to read your prerequisites because you have VM setup work to do for that class, and it does take several hours in order to get your VM all up and running and going. Then I teach mastering query tuning on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I do weekend rotations of some of the classes. And then Monday we fly down to Mexico. Woo! So I'll be down there for the rest of the year. So thanks y'all for hanging out with me, and I will see y'all in January of 2021. Thank God 2020 will be over. Adios. See y'all later.